you first teach your kids how to knit, there are going to be a lot of questions coming your way. Okay, the first one is, how can I tell how many rows I've knit? So when you're doing only the knit stitch, which means you're knitting flat and you're knitting across one side, flipping, knitting across the other side, flipping, knitting across again, you're doing what's called garter stitch. Means you're taking knit stitches and you're just going back and forth on them. So to count how many rows that you've knit in the garter stitch, you're going to count the horizontal bumps by 2. So a horizontal bump, it's not a single purl stitch if what we're doing is knitting and knitting and knitting and knitting. 2 of those together make the big bump, the big ridge. So we're going to count by 2s. So anytime that you're counting your rows, we're going to count 2, 4, 6, 8, and so on to count how many rows you've done. Okay, the next one is, which part of this first stitch do I pick up? Now this is one that trips people up a lot of times, and I didn't find a lot of information on this when I was teaching my kids how to knit. So the biggest thing I can recommend is teaching your kids what the knit stitch looks like on its own, like the anatomy of a knit stitch, if you will. So when we have that knit stitch, the really common mistake is that the yarn that you are about to, your working yarn that you're about to do the yarn over and off jumps jack and all that, is pulled up and over your needle. And what that does is it's pulling what's actually the bottom part of the stitch upward, and it makes it look like it's 2 stitches, and that's not where we want to insert our needle. So we're going to pull that yarn back down, and you're going to see just the one stitch over your needle, and that's where you're going to insert your yarn. So I always remind my kids to pull that down so you only see the 1 stitch. Because a really common mistake in learning how to knit is that you end up with 1 extra stitch, and 99% of the time it's because you knit twice on that first stitch on the needle. Which leads me to the next question: how did I end up with an extra stitch on my needles? Again, check that you're really going slowly on that first stitch. You're only knitting once into that stitch. The second is just the tip that if you cast on something with 8 stitches, be counting each row. I know it's tedious, but especially as you're learning and you get going, make sure when you finish that row, you still only have 8 stitches on the needle. Then you do the next row, same thing. Be counting, check in with yourself. If you go 6 rows and you realize now you're up to like 12 stitches, it's going to be a lot harder to fix that mistake than it is if you just did 1 row and somehow added an extra stitch into that. And while it is possible to fix a knitting mistake from multiple rows down, it's not a beginner thing yet, so I wouldn't recommend even putting your kids in that situation. Have it just be like a little checklist. If they need a little piece of paper next to them with the little box that each row they checked, yes, 8 stitches, yes, 8 stitches, that's even worth it compared to just kind of setting them up for frustration. Okay, the next question, what was the last stitch I did? So if you set down your knitting and you were in the middle of the row, it's sometimes really hard to know, especially as you're starting to learn how to knit, what direction was I knitting, what was the last stitch I knit, and what direction do I need to go? So you're always going to have your working yarn. That means the yarn that's attached to your stitch, that is attached to your yarn ball, that's always going to be in your right hand. So anytime you pick up your yarn and you pick up the needles, you don't want to be working with the working yarn in your left hand. It's always got to be in your right hand, because otherwise you're going to start missing stitches and you're going to start going backwards. Okay, how do I know if it's ready for an off jumps jack? So if you are new here, one of my favorite books to introduce kids to knitting with is called Annie and the Swiss Cheese Scarf. She has a really good rhyme in there, including the line off jumps jack. And so when you are doing an off jumps jack, it means that your needle has already been wrapped and it's ready to jump off of the left needle. If it's not properly wrapped, then it's going to just drop the stitch. Can you do too many once around the backs? So again, this is from the sing-songy rhyme from the Annie and the Swiss Cheese Scarf book, which if you haven't read, I recommend going and doing that. Pick it up from your library or Amazon or thrift books, wherever. It's a really good one to have. So just one once around the back is all we need, and that just means on your right needle, you're going to have the yarn wrapped 1 time before you do the off jumps jack. Okay, the next question is, if I let go of my knitting, how do I know which direction to go? Which is very similar to what I was just talking about. You're going to go in the direction where you have the working yarn in your right hand. and you're moving the stitches from your left needle onto your right needle until the left needle is totally empty, and then you're switching empty needles in your right hand, full needles in your left hand, and you're putting those left stitches onto your right hand. Okay, the next question is, does my stitch look right? It's really important for new knitters to understand what I call the anatomy of a stitch. If you're just keeping track of how many stitches are on your needle, which is what we want you to do, but you don't know what the stitch is supposed to look like, you might kind of take a wonky turn. And this is where you end up with holes and twists and drop stitches, hence the Swiss cheese scarf scenario that Annie was in. So I will link down below. I have a printable coloring book, and in it I have stitches up close for them to color. If they're past coloring, they can color and label or just label so that they're really understanding what that stitch is supposed to look like. So whatever you do in learning how to knit, make sure your kids know what a knit stitch is supposed to look like so that they can start to self-correct those mistakes as they make them. Okay, the next one is not a question, but what if your child is ready to move on to the purl stitch? So my daughter wanted to do this back at Christmas time because she wanted to knit one side and purl the other side to give it the look of the small little detailed V's to make in a Christmas card. So here's my tip for that. First, show them how to do it by you doing it. And this is why I think it's so important that you're learning alongside your children, because what you're going to do is you're going to have them knit a row, hand it to you, you're going to purl a row. Hand it to them, they're going to knit a row, and then you're going to purl a row. And then they're going to knit a row, and they're going to try purling a row. So what we did was for about an inch, just a few rows before I was ready to pass it off to her and she could do knitting one side, purling the other side without me having to alternate in there with her. Okay, so I wanted to end this video with a question that I asked my daughter after she was learning how to knit. I asked, what was your favorite part of learning how to knit? And her answer was that she liked that she could knit for a very, very, very long time and make something big. Teaching kids to knit is really fun, but if it's become frustrating, take a break. 6 months off, a few months here and there, don't push it. If they're ready for it, they're going to show interest in it. If they're not ready for it, don't push it. You can get them interested in knitting in other ways, including fun field trips that are kind of knitting and fiber related, really good books about knitting, and I'll link my favorite picture books down below about knitting. And if they decide that they want to knit, you are going to be ready. Because knitting is a skill, but it's also a hobby, so we don't want to force it and we don't want to push it, and we want it to be fun. And I hope that you're enjoying learning alongside them.